Uh, okay, I think we're back on. Who knows for certain? Uh,
Sorry, guys, that's Jim's fault. My bad.
that's my fault, but I'll blame it on James Lowell over here, part of the James game. Anyway, if you want to get the intro, you can go to my Facebook page and bring it up if you want to. So we're looking at this great letter called Philippians that Paul wrote to his followers of Jesus in Philippi. Short letter. It comprises one of the prison letters, all letters that Paul wrote while he was in a Roman prison. So only 104 verses that Paul penned in probably about 62 AD when he was a prisoner. He wrote this letter because the church at Philippi sent a gift to him by way of a guy by the name of Epaphroditus, who found Paul in Rome where he's under house prison, and delivered this special offering and a letter from the people in Philippi to Paul. And this really ministered to Paul at a time of great difficulty in his life. And while some of the letter is kind of a thank you note for that gift, it's much, much more than that. And within the letter is sharing of Paul's ability to have joy in every aspect of life. And so the first week of our study, I encourage you to read the letter and then highlight or underline the times that the word joy or rejoice or gladness, all differentiations of the concept of joy that's found in the book of Philippians. And I don't know about you, but I found 19 times that Paul mentions joy, rejoicing, or gladness. So we're examining those occurrences through our study to talk about how we can have joy during the difficult times that we're facing right now. So what was the secret of Paul's joy? I mean, how could Paul, in spite of danger and discomfort and being quarantined, be overflowing with joy? I think the answer to that is another word that is used repeatedly through the course of the letter, and it's the word mind. He uses the word mind 10 times, the word think 5 times, and if you throw in the time he says remember, that's 16 references to the idea of our mind. And I think this is a clue how you and I can have joy in our life today. It's remarkable that we as followers of Jesus, the way we think, our attitudes that we have in our life is part of the ability that we have to retain joy despite circumstances, people, things, worry, whatever comes up within our life. Outlook really does determine outcome in our life. I've certainly found that to be true in my life. A verse that actually my parents made me memorize years ago. So yes, there is value in memorizing Bible verses. It comes in handy later on in your life or in short time in your life. And this was in the old King James Version. And it's Proverbs chapter, I think it's 23 verse 7, if I remember right. For as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. So your attitude, where you focus your thinking, is huge in retaining and experiencing joy in your life in the best and in the worst of times. Paul was living in one of those worst of times. And I don't know whether you've realized of that, but most of the Bible was written out of circumstances that were tough, just excruciating at times. I mean, we're going to talk about this on Sunday, but you just think of all the different experiences of Bible characters. Most of them went through very tough times. And Paul is living in one of the worst of those times. As I read these verses, I want you to hear, or as you read them with me, I want you to see and hear and see if there's even a hint of resentment or of negativity in Paul's words. Here's what he says. Now, I want you to know, brethren, that my circumstances have turned out for the greater progress of the gospel, so that my imprisonment is for the cause of Christ has become well known throughout the whole Praetorian Guard and to everyone else. And most of the brethren, he's talking about other followers of Jesus that were in Rome, trusting in the Lord because of my imprisonment, have far more courage to speak the word of God without fear. Now, that doesn't sound like a guy who is licking his wounds or having a pity party, sitting there with an iron cuff on one hand, cuffed to a Roman soldier, and everybody is not in the best of mood, I think, around that. And Paul says that his circumstance turns out for a greater progress of the gospel. I mean, that's incredible, considering what this guy has been through and all. We would call them setbacks, but Paul calls them progress in his life. And it's an interesting term. I think it's an interesting term where he says it's been created for the progress of the gospel. Paul selected this Greek term. It's kind of colorful. It was used in ancient times to describe a gang of pioneer woodcutters who preceded an advancing army, clearing the way through otherwise an impenetrable forest of trees and underbrush so that the army might progress, go on. And Paul viewed our circumstances, or his circumstances, as having cleared the way for the progress of the gospel. It's been interesting at times to hear different people talk about during these days of quarantine of how they have grown closer to Jesus during this time, or how through their sharing of faith with others has broadened other people's outlook on what Christianity is all about. I had a conversation with a family last week that talked about their two teenage daughters in their house, and this has given them an opportunity to talk more to them. They sat down and watched The Passion of the Christ together, and what a impactful movie that was. But it gave opportunity to explain why Jesus came and why that horrible, horrendous death, what that meant for them personally as teenagers and for them as a family. And the gospel was progressed in that way. So how do we look at these circumstances that we find ourselves in, like Paul did, that is not the greatest thing in the world? It's a mindset. It's our attitude. It's our way of thinking makes a huge difference. The word I think that we need to keep perhaps in mind in order to rejoice in these circumstances is the word reframe. Maybe you've heard of that before, reframe. It means to change the way something is considered, the way something is thought about. Linda Bloom, in a great work that's called Stronger in Broken Places, said, and I think I've said this before, but life is often difficult. We don't get what we want. Anybody give me an amen on that? We don't get what we want. We get a lot of what we don't want. To say that Paul is getting a lot of difficulty in his life, well, that's really a gross misunderstatement. A couple of millennia after Paul wrote this letter, psychologists coined a type of therapy to describe the mindset that Paul has here in Philippians chapter 1. It's called cognitive therapy. Some call it cognitive reframing. But God knew about it before psychologists ever discovered a way to use it in therapy, and the way they discovered it was just watching human behavior. But it's a way of thinking differently at a situation or a person or relationship by changing its meaning, changing the way you think about it. It's also, as I said, referred to as cognitive reframing. And it's a strategy that therapists often use to help clients look at a situation from a slightly different perspective. When the frame is viewed and looked at, the essential idea behind it is changing a person's point of view to see it from a different, it's like looking through the lens of a camera, and you might change the angle and you see a whole different way of looking at something. We often think that our outlook is the only way to see a problem. If a friend doesn't call us back, she must be mad. If we fail a test, I must be a failure, or I'm stupid. In situations like that, psychologists tell us to ask questions like, is there another way to look at this situation? Or what what are the other possible reasons that this could have happened? And that's known as reframing. Now, what Paul says is our mindset needs to have something that changes the focus that we have when we look at different situations in our life. And so in verses 15 and following, he kind of looks at a situation that's come up, one particular one, and he reframes it. So verse 15, he says this: some, to be sure, he says, are preaching Christ from envy and strife. Oh my, have you not had a situation in your workplace? And now he's talking about a situation that may exist in my workplace and what I do of speaking the gospel or teaching the Bible. And some people do it, unfortunately, from envy of other people, or they do it in order to create a particular impression, or they do it in order to have a material gain from it. And sometimes people present the gospel and put down all other churches and things like that and create strife. But Paul says some actually do it from goodwill. He said the latter do it out of love, knowing that in his personal situation that I was appointed for the defense of the gospel. The former, talking about those who have bad motives, proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition rather than pure motives, thinking to cause me to distress in my imprisonment. So Paul says, what then? I mean, only this, he says, in every way, whether it's in pretense or in truth, Jesus is proclaimed. And then he says, this is our phrase, one of the 19 times that he uses it in this letter, in this I rejoice. And then he emphasizes it again by saying, yes, I will rejoice. I love that about Paul, because sometimes you have to really work at reframing. You have to work at your own mind to get it off of negativity or off of the pessimistic viewpoint or off of bad motives and the line of thinking that begins to create within our head. And so he says, in this I rejoice. Yes, I will rejoice. For he says, I know that this will turn out for my deliverance through your prayers and the provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, according to my expectation and hope that I will not be put to shame in anything, but that with all boldness, even now as always, be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. And here's the mindset. Here's the thing that for Paul made this joy possible. He says, for me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. What an incredible outlook and attitude he had. What he's saying is, as I live, and what I live for is that Jesus be proclaimed by the way I live, by what I say to other people, how I represent them to other people. For me, that is life. That's what gives me a passion for life, to live as Christ. Then he goes on to say, but you know what? If I die, they take my life from me. That's even greater. To die is gain. Paul has a little different attitude towards death than many of us do. We look at death as being the great robber of all things. And in many ways, it does rob us of the presence of people that we love. But Paul says, listen, there's more, and you've heard this time and again. This isn't just preacher words. It really is a mindset that will change circumstances from grave to joy. And that is, to die is gain. It's a gain to go home and be with Jesus. Man, that's wonderful. But if I'm living here, I'll live for Jesus. And so, friends, that is the mindset of joy. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. That type of mindset is able to reframe whatever life throws you into a perspective of joy. Truly, truly, only Christ can satisfy. Whether we have or we don't have, whether we're known or we're not known, whether we live or die, death only sweetens the deal. And that alone is enough for us to regain our joy in our life. I believe that you have already found circumstances in this time of quarantine that we've had and social distancing that you have become irritable. I think all of us have had our times of irritation just grow on us and absolutely overwhelm us. And we've lost our joy in the midst of it. And we're a little concerned because we don't know what the future holds. We're not sure we'll have a job or won't have a job, whether people that we know and love will be here or not be here. We don't, whether we will have things, because we may lose a job or we may lose our retirement income or our savings or whatever it might be. All those things that are unknown can rob us of our joy. But Paul says, literally, whatever comes to live for Christ, man, that's joy. And if I die, that's even greater joy. I get to be home for Jesus. So when Jesus becomes our central focus, our reason for existence, there is a contentment that replaces our anxiety as well as our fears, our insecurities. And that cannot help but impact the most prevalent joy stealers in our life. Maybe you would like to just kind of run down some things or post here on some of the insecurities that people face, and perhaps even suggest, for at least for yourself, how you can reframe some of those things to put forth a different attitude towards them. Fear of the future. Well, different attitude may be, I know who holds my future. My identity is not in who other people, what other people call me or what they think about me. My identity, as we said the very first week, is the fact that I'm a servant of God and that I'm one of his saints, one of the people that he has set apart specifically for his purposes in life. And that purpose is to live for him and have an influence on other people in my life. Let me give you 3 quick thoughts, if I could, that I want to leave with you today as we look at just these verses here in Philippians chapter 1. Having this attitude to live is Christ and to die of gain, I think does 3 things for us. One, it broadens the dimension of our circumstances, and that gives us new confidence. Chains that once bound us, like the chains that bound Paul while he was in prison, whatever those chains might be in your life, whatever irritation those chains can have, when our circumstances, the dimension of our circumstances are reframed, it broadens them and they no longer seem so irksome in our life. Limitations become a challenge rather than a chore. I've got to tell you, when the word went out that we were going to all be quarantined, no gatherings more than 10 people, I was very concerned because I could not figure out how the gospel, the teachings of Christ were going to get out. I wasn't sure how well our church would hang together during this time without the physical contact with one another. And it's been amazing how developing a different mindset that has gone beyond those limitations has resulted in some creativity. I mean, how else would we have known some things about Jim Landis, about how much he loves Lopez Grill, if we'd not had these Q&A times on Facebook? How much different would it be for us to realize that in the last few weeks, if we look at the number of viewers we've had just watching our Sunday morning services, and if there was 2 or people in the household, this is building on the amount of contacts or connections that we had during that time, we surpassed our actual average on Sunday morning attendance. There It's amazing how many people that we don't, not even sure who they are, just except to have an IP address on them, is we're connecting and hearing about face-to-face conversations that Jesus had. Isn't that exciting to know that when our mind begins to reframe things, it broadens the dimensions of our circumstances, and we can accept things as a challenge rather than a chore. The second thing that I think we can learn from that is that this mindset of Jesus Christ and dying again delivers us from preoccupation with other people's opinions, other people's motives, other people's criticisms, as Paul outlined about people who are criticizing him about his preaching, what he did there in Rome. They no longer seemed important to him. It became instead of a burden, his mindset was one of joy, and for him to live as Christ and die as gain, that's a great deliverance from having to live under the tyranny of other people's expectations, when some of those expectations are just things we're creating in our own mind. The third thing that this mindset does is this. The mindset calms our fears regarding ourselves and our future. It gives us the ability to project fresh hope into daily basis, because once fear is removed, peace follows in that vacuum. We're going to talk more about that once we get to chapter 4. So keep reading in Philippians and keep developing this ability to rejoice by creating a new mindset within you. I hope that you, I know we're not on Facebook as far as doing our daily readings from John right now, so I would suggest just keep reading through the book of Philippians. Read a chapter a day, and these 4 simple chapters, 104 verses. If you haven't looked yet, find how many times it talks about joy or mind or thinking or remembering, and try to reframe some of your fears in a different change of mindset that will bring joy to your life. Hey, thanks for being with us this morning. We're glad you could join us online. Please remember that tomorrow night at 7 o'clock, Randy's going to be leading us some worship. Worship's a great way to keep your joy. Thanks for being with us. Goodbye.
Yeah, use the actual thing. It's not touchscreen. Bye, church.
Bye.
Did it end?
No, we didn't.
Come on, end.
We're trying to end this. We don't.
Bye again.
Bye again.
It's the ending, James. You should like the
So that's it.